much, Dana. We'll move to item 8 of our agenda, communications from myself as well as the City Council. Why don't we start on the left here tonight? Andy, any communications this evening? Okay. I'm going to go next. I think just to kind of cut to the chase, but we do have 2 work session items that I think we need to address, and then I'll clearly come back to you, Ben and Giuseppe, for comments. The first being the viaduct improvements. I'd like to give staff some feedback, and Craig in particular, and direction on how to move forward with that project, given the staff report and the public comment received this evening. Thoughts?
I did actually like what Rhonda said at the end of the meeting, which is that if we got the lighting done and the way to water the plants and the shared use paths done, I think it would be a nice start. I just don't know how we are going to fund it all, but I liked the plan overall.
Ben?
So I've said this up here before. I do agree that I see this as an important project for the community in the future. I mean, the viaduct is something that our citizens see and drive over every day in many cases. I personally have ridden my bike and walked across that thing a lot of times, and let me tell you, the way it sits right now, try putting a baby carrier on the back of your bike and crossing that narrow sidewalk, and then somebody has to jump over the barrier or something to get around. It's terrible. So I'm very excited to see this go forward. I mean, I do think some of these items in here are pretty expensive and may make sense to pair with other things or other future unidentified funding sources. But I would like to see, it seemed to me that the lighting part of it, and possibly the fence, but I'm on the fence, would make sense to include in the first phase of how we approach this project, in my opinion. At the same time, I want to point out the fact that we have allocated $300,000 and there isn't enough to even do the first part of that, according to the estimates that we saw in that meeting. So in my opinion, I would like to include those in those 2 items in particular. But I would also like for us to figure out how we're going to fund the darn thing. And so that seems like a question maybe we should discuss.
So your suggestion, Ben, is to move forward with phase 1 installation of the shared use path and phase 2 the ornamental lighting. Is that correct? As a package?
That would be my opinion.
Funding pending, of course. Or pending funding. Dana, do you want to speak? Giuseppe, go ahead.
I have 2 points on this, and they're consistent with what I said back in March. And I have letters from people, and some have been forwarded to Michelle, concerned about what was discussed during the transportation plan about evacuation from the biggest cul-de-sac in Montana. I know we can drive out Edgewood, but the viaduct is another bottleneck. And Craig, I had asked if there was a scenario where we would have the room for 3 lanes, at least in case of emergency. And at that time, you talked to me about, I think, 60 or 66 feet wide carriageway that would allow for 3 lanes. I don't care if we put 1 lane right now, but I feel very uncomfortable when we look at a transportation plan that looks down 20 years down the road, and we're spending whatever we'll agree that we can spend to have only 2 lanes, 1 north and 1 south. Maybe we should consider a traffic study dedicated to that area. And maybe we've done it, and you can point to me offline, where we have 2 lanes, one way and 1 lane the other way, or a medium lane, so that in case of emergency, you can turn all 3 lanes south, or on a powder day, in the morning, you turn 2 lanes northbound and 1 southbound, and the evening the other way around. These are suggestions that came on public comments as well, but I had asked you back in March too. The other concern I have is obviously money. You know me on this, so I'm concerned about discussing anything for which, and I agree with Ben at this point, for which we at the moment do not see how to even fund phase one.
Further comments from the council? I had a question, Dana, or Andy, go ahead. No, go ahead first. I just had a general question, Dana. When our TIF was in its final days, which proved very fruitful for the city, obviously the entire TIF district, there was always comment made that when the TIF did sunset, that there would be this windfall of general fund revenue that we'd be able to leverage for continued capital investment projects that provide a return on our investment, of course. And I know that we had staff costs allocated to TIF, so after those costs were considered, because they're going to be ongoing, we'd have, you know, roughly $800,000 to play with, plus or minus. I haven't seen that mentioned, or I haven't heard that mentioned since the TIF sunset. Is that still there?
So actually, if you think back to when our TIF sunset, the council decision was to reduce mills, 10 mills. And so, you know, back then it was equivalent of about, we'll just say 40,000 for easy math. So we actually stopped collecting $400,000 from taxpayers. So we actually offset that growth in the taxable value. So we have the 400,000 that was probably 450 for staff. 400,000 we gave back to taxpayers and did not collect. And then during COVID, we gave back another 10 mills on top of that. So we gave back another $400,000 roughly. So we've really actually alleviated the tax burden on our taxpayers through using a TIF. So that's what helped us get through the pandemic. I would say though, when I look at the financials, and I pulled up the wrong one and I was just gonna pull this one up. When I look at the CIP and look at our capital improvement plan for streets, I would comfortably be able to tell you that we could spend down reserves in that fund to at least address items 1 and 2. That's an additional $460,000 that we would need. That will wipe out the estimated remaining cash balance for street projects for fiscal year 23. But we do know that, you know, this would probably span a couple fiscal years potentially, since we have to go through the bidding process and everything. Also knowing that those figures that are provided to us could be way off because of inflation, and those could continue to go up. So that would be my recommendation. I understand that the fence isn't significantly more, but I would prefer to wait on that until we get into the budget for fiscal year 24. If we do see a recession, it could really change kind of the finances of the city. And I would say that, you know, if that does happen, actually costs probably come down, and it's probably a better time to build something like this. But I would say comfortably, I could tell the council you could move forward with 1 and 2.
In your opinion, and maybe this is a question for Craig, how positioned is the city for these grant opportunities that are coming down the pipeline, many of which are kind of geared towards safety improvements? And the reason I ask that is, does it make sense to not do the shared use component, because that is safety related, and wait on that component until we seek out grant opportunities? I certainly don't want to do that, but just trying to be somewhat fiscally responsible. If there's opportunities to bring grant dollars in the door to address safety deficiencies, I'm all for it.
I'll give you my opinion, and Craig can give you his after, but we already have a bike path there. We already have a separated pathway. Just expanding it to allow two-way traffic on both sides, I don't think will actually rise to the level of safety when you're looking at other communities that say don't have
even
any
have one.
path.
Yeah.
So the amount of effort to apply and wait, I personally don't know that we would have success in the safety grants.
No, I appreciate that.
I think maybe the one where we're tightening up the crosswalk at Railway, that could be a safety concern. But, you know, if we have to go through a study for how many incidents we've had, I just don't see that on the viaduct itself.
Well, and the railway intersection improvements are 130 to 160,000,
Right.
a portion of which are going to be borne by the developer on the west side. So I think that's a pretty low-hanging fruit we can tackle as a city.
Yep.
So thank you. I appreciate the candidness on that. Andy?
Yeah, just a couple quick comments. I mean, I'd like to see us move as fast as we can with all of the phases, but obviously we can't do that from a financial standpoint. If we could do the first two, I think that would be a good thing, I think. But the thing I actually really liked tonight more than anything was the elimination of the slip lanes, because those are not that confusing to drivers, because drivers typically just don't pay attention to pedestrians. They're super confusing to pedestrians, especially southbound on the viaduct coming by the O'Shaughnessy. It's just, people stop and there's no efficiency when there's pedestrians, because nobody knows kind of what to do, and kids come over there on bikes and they come over there on skateboards, and it's, so I'd like to see that. I think that, and Dana, you're right on it with that. I think that's a good safety thing that we could look at a grant opportunity for. But other than that, I'd like to, I think the bike path is important to get started, and if that's all we can fund to begin with, then I think we should fund that. I think widening those is important, because it is a safety issue there for sure. I mean, I go over the viaduct a lot, and it's, whether you're walking or biking or people pushing strollers or whatever, it's not safe currently. So I'd like to see us do that and do as much as we can and see what we can find out there for grant opportunities, so.
Entertain a motion to that effect.
So moved.
So that would be authorizing Public Works to initiate phase 1 and phase 2, or just proceeding with phase 1 and phase 2. Craig, is that an adequate motion? And then, of course, encouraging the city to look at opportunities to fund the railway intersection improvements as immediate needs. Is there a second to that motion? Seconded by Councilor Norton. Further discussion? All those in favor, please raise your hand. Those opposed, like sign. And that motion does carry on a 3-1 vote, with Councilor Galtabiano voting in opposition. Secondly, transitional zoning.